The greatest coincidences in the Bible. Why do I call these the greatest coincidences in the Bible? The Bible is filled with fascinating stories, some of which contain coincidences that seem too remarkable to be mere chance. Take note that what we refer to as coincidence is to be seen as providence. Number 1. Moses escapes death in Pharaoh's palace. The Exodus was Moses' time. An Exodus is the account of the greatest escape in history. Over 2 million slaves flee from one of the world's most heavily protected countries. It's an incredible story with a series of miracles, including some of the most well-known in the Bible. At the time, the Israelites were led by a man named Moses. He witnessed more miracles than Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob combined. With a number of miracles occurring one after another as God interceded on behalf of his people. Some of the miracles appear to be magic, such as when Moses' rod changes into a snake. But the majority are obvious natural manipulations as God demonstrates his power over all he has created for the welfare of his people. Moses was a man who evaded death. Moses was a very unique person as he experienced one of the greatest miracles in the Old Testament. As a newborn, Moses first opened his eyes to a cruel and unforgiving world. He was born in a nation of might, but he was a foreigner and oppressed during a time when all infants, such as himself, were under a royal death sentence. When Moses was born, the Israelites were experiencing a lot of difficulty in Egypt. A new king arose over Egypt and said to his people, "Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. They greatly outnumber us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, so that they will not multiply and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Moses' parents acted out of both natural parental instinct and faith in God. For 3 months, they hid him in some private apartment of their own house, despite the fact that doing so possibly put their own lives in danger had he been found. Midwives were ordered to put an end to the lives of all newborn male Hebrew children by the king's command. Only female children were to be allowed to live. This is where Moses' miracle happened. In order to protect her son, Moses, from death, Jochebed, Moses' mother, hid him in a basket of bulrushes and set him afloat on the Nile River. Probably, the mother of Moses was full of anxiety in the expectation of his birth now that this edict was in force. Observe the beauty of providence. Just at the time when Pharaoh's cruelty rose to this height, the deliverer was born, though he did not appear for many years after. Exodus chapter 2 verses 3 through 4. But when she could no longer hide him, she got him a papyrus basket and covered it with tar and pitch. Then she put the child in it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And his sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. When Jochebed released the handmade boat crafted with bulrushes into the river, she relinquished something that held immense value to her. However, she demonstrated a remarkable amount of faith and trust in God's providence, believing that he would guard and protect it. According to the biblical narrative, it was under the divine guidance of God that Pharaoh's daughter discovered the abandoned infant Moses. Despite being raised in a culture that taught her to reject the Hebrews, the cries of the helpless baby stirred a sense of compassion in her that she couldn't ignore. She was moved by an inexplicable force that compelled her to take the child under her care and raise him as her own. The only place a Hebrew baby would be safe was in an Egyptian home, and the day that Moses was placed in his would-be casket, he didn't just find a home, but an Egyptian place. The coincidence also does not stop here. Exodus 2. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a wet nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go ahead." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, and said, "Because I drew him out of the water." Moses' mother had the protection of the government and wages to take care of a child that would have been wrongfully executed. Isn't that amazing? God had this beautifully planned for the deliverance of both Moses and, subsequently, for the deliverance of the people of Israel as well. He expertly steered Moses' parents, the flow of the Nile, and the affections of Pharaoh's daughter to accomplish his will. Through a combination of resourcefulness from Moses' family and Pharaoh's daughter's desire to have a child, God orchestrated a unique opportunity for Moses' mother to nurture and educate him during his formative years, while also receiving compensation for her efforts. There is no doubt that it was during these formative years that Moses gained knowledge of the God of the fathers and came to the realization that the Hebrews were his fellow countrymen. In the palace, Moses would definitely learn certain customs that would enable him to face the Pharaoh years in the future and save the Israelite people. While his testimony was great, the next person on our list had a more outrageous coincidence story. Number 2. Mordecai is saved due to sleeplessness. Mordecai is first introduced in Esther chapter 2 verses 5 through 7. The book of Esther is unique for 2 reasons. It is one of only 2 books in the Bible named after women, along with Ruth, and it is one of only 2 books in the Bible that never mentions God's name directly, together with the Song of Solomon. As a result, many people have been perplexed by Esther. Though we never see the name of God, we clearly see his hands in a great coincidence. Mordecai was in exile in a region that did not respect Mordecai's people by law. His people could easily be enslaved or killed with a simple stamp by the king. Mordecai and his niece Esther went through the most nail-biting event ever. The story first starts on a very surprising note when the Queen of Persia refuses to appear before the king and was cast out. The most powerful position is then miraculously obtained by his exiled niece. No one knew that the queen was from the most oppressed clan. This itself was a miracle. You see, someone proposed that the king have a beauty pageant, with the winner becoming his wife. It was a significant issue. Esther had a year's worth of beauty treatments prior to entering the competition. She was proclaimed Xerxes' new queen as a result of her victory. By proxy, Mordecai, the exile, had the most unimaginable power for someone with his status. He had a connection to royalty. However, we are yet to reach the great coincidence. Because the empire's Jewish communities were in danger due to anti-Semitic sentiments, she kept their relationship a secret at Mordecai's request. We notice the position of another man who was exalted in the court at the time as we set the scene. He was known as Haman, and he is Mordecai's antagonist. He was a descendant of Agag. The prophet Samuel had instructed Saul, Israel's first king, to go defeat Agag. Samuel took over after Saul refused to kill Agag and hacked him to bits in front of the Lord's altar. As a result of this occurrence in history, there was hatred between the Agagites and the Jews, and Haman harbored animosity for the Jews. We have an intriguing situation. The Persian Empire's queen is a Jewess who, and Haman is a high-ranking courtier who despises all Jews. It became a crisis when Haman urged that everyone worship the emperor. Haman informed the king when Mordecai refused. He emphasized that the empire's Jews should be destroyed altogether. They were distinct, with their own laws, traditions, and religion. They were misfits who needed to be let go. He also offered the treasury a hefty reward if the monarch agreed to exterminate the Jews. To determine when all the Jews would be executed in secret, they literally drew lots. On the 13th day of the month, a lot was cast to determine the fate of the Jewish people. This is one of the reasons why the 13th day has long been associated with superstition. When the Jews found out what was going to happen, they fasted, wore sackcloth, and wore ashes. Mordecai sent Esther a message begging the king for mercy. He claimed that God had brought her to the kingdom for a specific reason. She was thus in a position to assist her people. So Esther faced a real battle. Should she reveal that she was Jewish? If she did, her life would be at stake too. But she decided that if she perished, she perished. So how was she to make the request known? The queen could only see the king if she was summoned, but she knew she had to see him. So she boldly entered his presence and proposed a banquet, with Haman as the honored guest. The king granted the request, and the meal was properly set up. Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife. Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Have a pole set up, reaching to a height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself." This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. Now, Mordecai is in a supposedly tough bind. The second most powerful man in the land wants him dead, and that night he was going to get the permission to kill Mordecai. Esther does not know about this, so it would be a miracle to survive the night. But God kept Ahasuerus awake to thwart the evil scheme. In trying to make the best of his insomnia, the king had the chronicles of his reign read to him. By divine coincidence, the portion that was read contained the account of the attempt on his life which had been foiled by Mordecai. Upon inquiry, it was learned that nothing had ever been done to reward him for this service. Strangely enough, it was at the very same time that the king had an impulse to reward the man who had saved him from the assassins. When Haman entered, Ahasuerus asked the general question, "What shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor?" Thinking that his own great moment had come, Haman suggested the most elaborate parade and the bestowing of honors, second only to those of the king himself. Haman further suggested that a public announcement be made as the parade moved through the city. "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Thereupon the king ordered Haman to hurry and bestow all these honors not on Haman, but on Mordecai, the Jew. Haman went out to proclaim his worst enemy as the man whom the king delighted to honor. Pride went before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Then the king said to Haman, "Quickly, take the royal robe and the horse, as you have said, and do this for Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate. Leave out nothing of all that you have said." So Haman took the royal robe and the horse and dressed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the open square of the city, proclaiming before him, "This is what shall be done for the man whom the king desires to honor." Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his own house, mourning and with his head covered in sorrow. Then Haman told Zeresh his wife and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise counselors and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall in status, is of Jewish heritage, you will not overcome him, but will certainly fall before him." While they were still speaking with him, the king's eunuchs, attendants, arrived and hurriedly brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Therefore, after a pole was created to hang him, on that night, the king went through the book that detailed Mordecai's actions to save the king. Then Haman, the antagonist, mistakenly told the king to bless Mordecai, thinking that he was rewarding himself. It almost looks like Haman was devoted to the greatness of Mordecai. As Haman honored him in front of the city, it was an incredible event, certainly the result of God's hand. The amazing thing is that this is still not the end. At the feast, Esther found the courage to speak to the king about her people. When the king learnt of Haman's heinous plot, he had him hanged on the gallows that had been erected especially for Mordecai. A fresh decree was published, overriding Haman's orders and guaranteeing the Jews the right to self-defense as well as the authority to assemble and annihilate any armed force that could attack them. Because assassins were waiting to slay all the Jews across the empire, it was a stunning intervention. As a result, when Haman's edict to exterminate the Jews came to fruition, the Jews were ready and proceeded to defeat their opponents and slay Haman's family. So Mordecai got saved by his enemy. If this had not happened, there would have been no Jews left because the Persian Empire spanned from India to Egypt. If the original edict had been followed, Jesus would not have been born. As a result, Esther stepped in to save the day. It's no wonder that the Jews celebrate Purim every year to honor these events. Mordecai's trust in God shone throughout the tale of Esther, serving as a light of hope for those around him and a source of strength for Esther. His words and deeds revealed the man who was not interested in gaining prestige or following the crowd, but rather in standing up, at times alone, for what he considered to be God's will. Number 3. Ruth meets Boaz, her savior. The events of the book of Ruth took place during the time of the Judges, a terrible period in Israel's history in which a vicious cycle kept repeating itself. The people fell into idolatry. God allowed their enemies to oppress them. They cried out to him for deliverance. He raised up a judge to rescue them, and they fell back into idolatry. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Ruth chapter 1 verses 1 through 2. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Ruth chapter 1 verses 3 through 5. Her circumstances had deteriorated to the point where she had no way of supporting herself in Moab. When Naomi learned that the famine in her native Israel had ended, she made the decision to return to Judah. She encouraged her daughters-in-law to return to their childhood homes in Moab, and she prayed that God would bless each of them with a new husband. Naomi felt that the women would be squandering their lives if they stayed with her because she couldn't provide either with another husband or herself because she was more or less destitute. As she puts it, the Lord's hand had turned against her. Yet, it was through her very difficult situation that God was about to work in a big way. Regardless of what Naomi said, Ruth was determined to stay with her. Despite the fact that Orpah turned back, Ruth said, "Wherever you go, I will go. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." She even swore an oath to stay with her mother-in-law for the rest of her life. Her devotion was so strong that she preferred widowhood and its difficulties to abandoning Naomi and her God, implying that she'd come to believe in him in part because of the woman's testimony. Ruth had clearly made a complete break with her past by rejecting the Moabites' idolatry and embracing Israel's God as her own. Because Ruth was adamant, Naomi stopped attempting to persuade her, and the 2 women returned to Bethlehem. Naomi returned to Israel as a broken, bitter woman. She told her hometown's people, "The Lord has opposed me, and the Almighty has afflicted me." And while Naomi was truly despondent, the barley harvest was approaching. She could see that God had put an end to the famine, which had driven her family away into their graves. In the midst of her hopelessness, there was hope. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain following one in whose eyes I may find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she left and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Ruth chapter 2 verses 1 through 3. God was preparing sleepy Bethlehem, Naomi's hometown in the male lead to whom we've introduced here, as the site of his miraculous interruption at a later point in history through this story. Boaz was a wealthy relative of Elimelech and the son of Rahab, the same former prostitute who hid Israel's spies and survived the fall of Jericho due to her faith in God. Ruth desired to serve and care for Naomi, so she requested to go into the fields and collect fallen grain. The law of Moses, as if given with Ruth and Naomi in mind, provided for the poor by commanding the Israelites to leave some grain behind at harvest time so that the poor could gather it and eat. So Ruth went behind the harvesters to gain grain, but seemingly by chance, she happened to be in Boaz's section of the field. Every time we see what we believe to be a coincidence in the Bible, we should look at it as providence. Of course, nothing happens by chance, and no one happens to be anywhere at any given time. The author's use of "happened to be" acknowledges God's providential working in Ruth's life. When Boaz arrived and learned who the gleaning woman was, he was moved by her plight and offered her provision and safety. Ruth couldn't understand why he had chosen her, especially since she was a Moabitess, a foreigner in Israel. Boaz basically told her that she was simply reaping the benefits of the life she had chosen. Her kindness, service to her mother-in-law, and decision to seek refuge in the Lord's provision had brought her blessing. Ruth's concern for Naomi would have been especially meaningful to Boaz because Naomi's husband was a relative. Because of Ruth's steadfast commitment, Boaz bestowed a blessing on her, requesting that the Lord under whose wings she had come for protection provide her with a spiritual covering. Ruth responded with humble gratitude. Then, Boaz generously provided her with additional assistance, more than the law required, so she wouldn't have to work as hard to provide for herself. And Naomi was pleased to see how well Ruth had done in her gleaning that evening, but she was surprised to learn that Boaz was the one who had shown her such kindness. Naomi recognized right away that this was no chance meeting. God's sovereign hand had made a connection for them. She informed Ruth that one of their family redeemers was Boaz. Boaz could fulfill the law of levirate marriage as a family redeemer or kinsman redeemer. This was an ancient provision that stated that if an Israelite man died without a son to carry on his family name, the man's brother could provide for him by marrying his widow. Given God's word's provision and the divine connection that had occurred between Ruth and Boaz, Naomi encouraged Ruth to continue working in Boaz's field. Then her mother-in-law Naomi said to her, "My daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may go well for you? Now then, is Boaz not our relative, with whose young women you were? Behold, he is winnowing barley at the threshing floor tonight. Wash yourself, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not reveal yourself to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. And it shall be, when he lies down, that you shall take notice of the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will tell you what you should do." And she said to her, "All that you say, I will do." So she went down to the threshing floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law had commanded her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was cheerful, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain, and she came secretly and uncovered his feet and lay down. And it happened in the middle of the night that the man was startled and bent forward, and behold, a woman was lying at his feet. So he said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your slave. Now spread your garment over your slave, for you are a redeemer." Ruth chapter 3, verses 5 through 9. Ruth agreed to Naomi's instructions and carried them out precisely. Boaz finally lay down for the night after a long day of work and a full stomach. Ruth then approached. He awoke with his feet exposed, perhaps feeling the cool of the evening, and was surprised to find a woman lying at his feet. Because it was dark, he asked Ruth to identify herself, to which she replied, "I am Ruth, your servant. Take me under your wing, because you are a family savior." Ruth was proposing marriage with these words and actions. She was also requesting that Boaz fulfill his legal obligation as a family redeemer. Ruth was reminding him of the blessing he had previously bestowed on her by asking him to take her under his wing. Boaz had said to her, "May you receive a full reward from the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Chapter 2, verse 12. Ruth was challenging him to become the human expression of that divine covering. Ruth had initially impressed Boaz, but she impressed him even more that night. Ruth had not pursued younger men, despite the fact that Boaz was older. This insight, however, was from Naomi, and Naomi's wisdom made Ruth a star in Boaz's mind. If Boaz redeems Ruth, she will be freed from her impoverished circumstances and formally adopted into God's chosen family. In a sense, she had given her life to Boaz. It was his job to ensure that the process was performed legally and her security afterwards was established. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he had relations with her. And the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today, and may his name become famous in Israel. May he also be to you one who restores life and sustains your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Ruth chapter 4, verses 13 through 15. Boaz and Ruth married, and God blessed them with a son named Obed. The women of the town rejoiced with Naomi and thanked the Lord for providing for this poor woman who had experienced great bitterness only a short time before. They even told Naomi that Ruth was more valuable to her than 7 sons. 7 sons would have been a supreme blessing because 7 was the biblical number of perfection or completion. Ruth, on the other hand, had proven to be an even better gift, thanks to God's grace. That's a lot of praise for this noble lady. For her faithfulness, God had blessed Ruth with a child, even as he would bless Mary many years later with the Son of God. Gentle and loving Ruth, a Moabite, cared deeply for her mother-in-law, Naomi. Ruth willingly left her comfort zone and the only world she had ever known to travel with Naomi to foreign Bethlehem. She exemplifies the strength and determination leaders must have to venture out and follow God, even if it means leaving family and friends behind. Ruth surrendered to Naomi's instructions in this strange and new culture. Boaz, her kinsman redeemer, eventually married her and bestowed security and protection on her. But when Ruth made the decision to follow Naomi's instructions, she had no idea how things would turn out. She simply took a leap of faith. Naomi prayed that Ruth would be known throughout Israel for her good deeds, and God is still answering that prayer today, as millions turn to the book of Ruth for memorable lessons on love and faithfulness. Ruth, the foreigner, found a permanent place in the lineage of our Savior Jesus Christ as the great-grandmother of King David. The Bible speaks about providence. The concept of providence, which is God's sovereignty over people, places, and events, is a recurring theme in the Bible. The story of Joseph is a perfect example of how God's providence works. At first glance, Joseph's life seems to be plagued with bad luck. He is sold into slavery by his own brothers, imprisoned for a crime he did not commit, and forgotten by those he helped. However, as the story progresses, we see how God's hand is guiding Joseph's life, even in the midst of his trials. In the end, Joseph becomes a powerful ruler in Egypt, being only second to Pharaoh. So, he was able to say to his brothers who sold him the following. Genesis chapter 50, verses 19 through 20. Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid, for I am in God's place. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to keep many people alive." People often only see the good and bad luck or chances that life presents without recognizing the bigger picture of the jigsaw puzzle. However, God sees the entirety of our lives from beginning to end and orchestrates events to work together for our good, as long as we love Him. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. Even the events that led to the suffering and crucifixion of Jesus Christ were not a tragic accident, but rather a necessary part of God's divine plan. Even the actions of those who contributed to Jesus' suffering, such as Herod, Pilate, the Gentiles, and the Jews, played a role in fulfilling God's purpose. Despite the pain and anguish that Jesus endured, His sacrifice ultimately led to the redemption of humanity and the fulfillment of God's plan for salvation. Acts chapter 4, verses 26 through 28. The kings of the earth took their stand, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against His Christ. For truly against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, were gathered together to do whatever your hand and your purpose determined before to be done. Acts chapter 2, verse 23. Him, being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God, you have taken by lawless hands, have crucified, and put to death. Life can be daunting if we view it solely as a series of fortunate or unfortunate events. However, if we view life through the lens of God's sovereignty, we begin to see things in a different light. God has determined our place and time of birth for a purpose. Acts chapter 17, verse 26. And He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation. There are numerous passages in both the Old and New Testaments where God's sovereignty is evident in the lives of individuals. Isaiah chapter 64, verse 8. But now, Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay, and you are potter. And all of us are the work of your hand. God even uses evil kings and calls them his servants, or his rod to bring chastisement on his children. Isaiah chapter 10, verse 5. Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, and the staff in whose hands is my indignation. Life is not luck, but God is the sovereign of the universe, doing what he wants with his property, which includes you and me.